Every time I see that, it just blows me away. Those lyrics could have been written this afternoon, right?
But when were they written? I'm sorry.
1862. It gives you an idea how long their struggle has been going on. The first thing I wanted to do here is just give you a quick look at the 6 sessions that we're going to be doing here over the next 6 weeks. Today we're going to do this kind of a recap of when I was attending Leningrad State University in Soviet Union in 1971. I mean, there's history that you read about and you research, and then there's the history you actually live yourself. And that was such an intense experience that I'm 72 and I'm still not over it, and I'm still doing this. So, the second one next week is got a bunch. This is the origins of the Russian and Ukrainian civilization, which in the beginning are one and the same, starting at about in the 10th century, 988 AD or so, and we're going to go right through Russian and mixed in, of course, Ukrainian history through 400 years of what was really a medieval democracy, interrupted by the Mongol invasion when the Tsarist autocracy began, and then finally the Imperial Russia. So that's a lot of ground to cover next week. Third session, we're going to skip over the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It's going to come back around when we talk exclusively about Ukraine, but we're going to jump right ahead to the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991, which will cover kind of when Joseph Stalin died, right up until Mikhail Gorbachev, and the end of the Cold War. How's that going so far? And Ukrainians' role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. They have a very, very direct role in that event. The next one, of course, is a wild and crazy guy, Boris Yeltsin. Took over after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a thing he called shock therapy, thought he could implement Western politics and economics real fast. It didn't go well. And the 5th session is exclusively about Vladimir Putin. And I'll just leave it at that for the moment. And the 6th one is totally dedicated to Ukrainian history, really starting at the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, right till the most recent events, I think. So that's the playbook. I'll just offer this up as a maybe, it depends on your interest. But the first time I did this thing, what was driving the interest in this back in 2017, 18 was the huge amount of cyber warfare being directed at the United States, particularly in the 2016 election. And so we built this whole presentation around how Russian intelligence services conduct cyber warfare. Now, it's not part of the curriculum here, but if you have a lot of interest in it, I'd be happy to go through it again. Just sort of it's up to you guys, because they're certainly still at it. But again, it's not really off. I wanted to keep the focus on Ukraine, but if you want to do this, we can definitely do that. So, okay, now to begin this thing, I was thinking about, I mean, I hate a history presentation that pretty soon starts feeling like you're reading an 800-page history book. Names, dates. And so I wanted to put a sort of a proposition out there before we get into, and everything today is going to be about just Russian history. We won't have any Ukrainian content today. Starting next week, we certainly will. But instead of diving right into, my experience over there in the Cold War, I've been mystified by the difficulty I've had, and maybe you too, is trying to understand what Winston Churchill said so famously: Russia's a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. What makes it so opaque? Understanding the Russian people and their motivations and their history. And it is, I still struggle to get my head around it. And then I came across this simple sentence, but I think, and this is what I really want to talk about. A people's history and culture is the glue that holds society together. And so what I want to do is just, with that in mind, history and culture hold society together as glue, is I want to spin through, is there any way to get that? That's okay, don't worry about it. There says George Orwell's thing that no, it's all right, I'll just read it. I can't do that either. The most effective way to destroy a people and their culture is to deny or destroy their own understanding of their history. Right, that's how you destroy a culture, is you obliterate and deny their own understanding of their history. I think the classic American example of that is the forced assimilation of Native Americans. I mean, that was a very overt attempt to obliterate somebody's sense of their own history. And there's just an analogy that, damn, I can't see the link. There it is. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to spin through, and we're going to cover all these bullet points in detail throughout the next 6 weeks, but with the thought in mind about what has happened to put yourself in the place of a Russian citizen. And I don't care if you're 72 years old or any age, and you've lived through what I'm going to take you through. Well, let's just go through it because it becomes, I hope, self-evident. So it's a cycle of destruction and creation and their history. For example, for 400 years, the Kiev Rus, which was the original incarnation of what we call Russia, centered on Ukraine, by the way, and what is today called Ukraine. It was centered in Kiev. That was a medieval democracy with the rule of law and property rights, self-government, for 400 years until the czars came along in the 15th century and utterly wiped it out. That was the beginning of the czarist autocracy, and Russian autocracy started then, and it's obviously continuing to today. But right there, the czars extinguished the original 400 years of democracy. So if you want to know where Russia started, it was not an autocracy at all. It was very much a democratic institution. So now we go through another 300 or so years of czarist history. Communism comes along, and of course, not only sort of obliterates the czarist age, it criminalizes it. I mean, you do not want to be somebody whose genealogy can be traced back to czarist roots or czarist aristocracy if you're now living in a communist country. And then, of course, Stalin takes over after Lenin dies in 1924, and he maligns the memory of Lenin. Lenin, in his mind, wasn't going aggressively enough to implement the communist project. And so I'm just picking one out of a whole bunch of things he did, but we're going to focus a lot tonight on religion. And one of the first things they do is that the Soviets implemented a policy of militant atheism, which effectively outlawed and erased 900 years of Orthodox Christian religion. for almost a century, I mean, for the age of the czars and before, Russia has always been a very devout Eastern Orthodox religious culture. And overnight, Stalin makes it illegal, destroys the churches, and anybody who tries to practice their religion and implement something that he called not just atheism, but militant atheism. And we're going to get into that in detail in a minute. Okay, so 1953, Stalin finally dies. Nikita Khrushchev comes along, and the first thing he does is denounce 30 years of Stalin's cult of personality genocide and just all the horrors that you can think of when you think of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev says, you know, all that Stalin age, here are all his crimes, and just, you know, said it all out loud. And there was a number of reforms Khrushchev did, like he relaxed freedom of speech. And for example, he made it legal, for example, to buy Alexander Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was the 1970 Nobel Prize winner for literature. Always banned. Under Khrushchev, it's okay. But then Brezhnev comes along in 1964 and deposes Khrushchev, rehabilitates Stalin. You know, all that stuff you said bad about Stalin, he's a great guy. I mean, he beat the Nazis, he beat Hitler. Now he's a hero again. Cracks down on freedom of speech and a lot of other reforms Khrushchev did. Oh yeah, and by the way, both of these men are native-born Ukrainians. Khrushchev and Brezhnev were born and raised in the Ukraine, and rose to being president of the Soviet Union. Of course, when they did that, all of their Ukrainian-based proteges were all installed in the Kremlin. I mean, it's hard to believe for all these years. The Kremlin was populated mainly by Soviet version of Ukrainians. Gorbachev comes along after Brezhnev, and he tries to not destroy communism, but reform it. He thought he could fix communism in the Communist Party and all that. He basically condemns the whole Soviet era and cuts all the Eastern European nations loose and says, you guys are on your own. You want to depose all your communist overlords, knock yourself out, we're not going to stop you. Yeltsin comes along, dissolves the USSR, outlaws the Communist Party. On December 25th, 1991, there was a thing called the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The next morning you woke up and it was gone. New flag on the Kremlin flying, new anthem, everything is Soviet is gone. We're gonna go back to that in more detail in a second. Now Putin comes along in 2001, after the Yeltsin era completely fails to implement Western economics and politics, and he dismantles everything that Yeltsin does in favor of this sort of kleptocracy mafia state that he introduces. But he says things in his inaugural speech in 2001, the Bolshevik Revolution and communism was a road into a blind alley. He's saying all that Western ideas that we were trying to implement, that was an even worse mistake, but we're not going back to communism. But what he does, remember, all this time, religion has been banned, militant atheism has been enforced. The first thing Putin does is he embraces Orthodox Christianity, and here's a card-carrying member of the Union of Militant Atheists, now in charge of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he basically replaces 80 years of state-enforced atheism with Orthodox Christianity again. Now, I don't know if you've lost track of how many violent, traumatic about faces these people have been through. Imagine you're our age, a lot of us, and you've lived through a bunch of this. Well, I'll tell you what, let me just go, the USSR, let me give you a concrete example of what I mean by the traumatic experience that the Russian citizens have been through. This is out of a book that we're going to go through in the third session. This is a wonderful book, Secondhand Time, and it really documents in real people, citizen, normal people, what it felt like to lose your country. And this is one of the verbatim examples of what if you're one of these guys and you are a decorated war veteran of the great patriotic war against Hitler. And we'll just read it. This is verbatim what they said. Red, the color of the revolution and the blood spilled in its name today, they are calling the 1970 revolution a coup, military coup, a Bolshevik conspiracy, a Russian catastrophe. Lenin was just a German agent. The revolution was brought about. Now, I cover my ears. It's more than I can take. My whole life, I believe that as communists, we were the luckiest people on earth, born in the most beautiful, extraordinary country in the world. I mean, why wouldn't those people believe that? They fought and died in the millions to protect it from the Nazis. But it's gone. On the 26th of December, the country and everything about that country is gone, replaced by nobody quite knows what yet. But then he says, but what's the point of remembering all this? It's as good as collecting the nails after a fire. That is one of the most evocative sentences I've ever read, where your house burns down and the only thing left is you find the nails in the ashes. Well, that's how they felt about everything that they and their grandfather, their parents lived for, which was this amazing heaven called the USSR. I mean, none of these citizens back then would have had any contact with the West at all. The only thing they ever knew was communist Russia. Everything that was once ours is now gone. That's what I mean by losing. You know, how many times can you ask your citizens to go through these traumas? And what happens every time one of these things happens? Heroes are now villains. I mean, those guys with the medals on their chest, their heroes aren't only obsolete, but they're reviled as villains. Saviors are now devils. Names of streets change. Statues are destroyed, but then rebuilt. Under Khrushchev, all the Stalin statues were destroyed. Putin has put them all back. Faces are scrubbed out of photographs, encyclopedias are changed. I ask you, after you go through this stuff that many times, what can you believe in anymore? What do you anchor your belief system in when you've been whipsawed back and forth with, a history based on, this guy calls it self-slaughter and betrayal? Do you deny it? Do you say it never happened? No matter how you look at it, you are now an orphan. You don't have a country anymore. You can't. What country? What social tradition do I now have to hang on to in the future? It's been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt so many times in your lifetime. All that guys like Putin have to do is history is rewritten to suit the present, because there is no past you can hang your hat on now. It's been destroyed too many times. So I just bring all this up is because I've developed a gigantic empathy for the Russian people. I mean, knowing what they've been through, right? And they seem incoherent. And if you go back to the original sentence about history and culture, my thesis is the Russians don't have any glue to hold their society together. There's no glue. They don't have it. We do. We argue about it. We fight about our, culture and the founding fathers and the Constitution. But we have some consistency that runs through our brief 240 years or something. I'm just saying that the thing that makes Russia such an enigma is they just don't have a glue holding their society together anymore. So does that make any sense? This is just it's what is history really telling you? And a lot of this is forced assimilation, right? It's kind of like the Native American kids getting their heads shaved over. It just reminds me of that. I don't know. But okay, so enough of that. So let's get into my just attending Leningrad State University in 1971. I learned not that long ago that while I was there with these other American students, Vladimir Putin was going to law school there at the same time. And for all I know, he was standing in front of me in the line in the cafeteria. I mean, it just freaks me out, right? It's like, holy crap. Okay. And this is just one thing I took. My dad brought back from Germany in World War II, one of these little Minox cameras. Ever seen one of these little Minox cameras? This came back with it from World War II. And it's just sort of the perfect camera for taking spy pictures in Russia. I mean, what could go wrong there, right? So real quick, so this is 1970. I was going to San Diego State at the time. They had a great Russian program, and they had worked. The first foreign exchange program really ever attempted was the one I was on, the first one. And about 30 students from different universities were invited into this program, and that's my like ID card there. And we flew to Finland, Helsinki, and then we took a train into Leningrad. By the way, St. Petersburg before the communists, Leningrad during the communists. Now it's back to St. Petersburg again. And we went to, Estonia and Moscow and Kiev and Yerevan, Armenia, and then out. This is because, like Nixon at the time, opened kind of the doors to China. He did the same kind of thing and with Brezhnev, and that kind of led to this kind of foreign exchange program with students and stuff. But what was going on? I mean, we still had 300,000 troops in Vietnam, and all that was still going on at the time. So we get on the train from Helsinki. And by the way, somebody from the US Embassy comes to talk to us, crazy 19-year-old American college students, clueless. And he just reminds, he said, now when you get into the Soviet Union, behave yourself, because if you get in trouble, the embassy's only responsibility is to notify your next of kin, full stop. We're not going to come get you, just so don't screw this up, guys. That was sobering. You get to the Weber, which was kind of the first stop on the train, and guards come on and they're looking for contraband, and they do the look through your luggage, and I just saw this. They ask you, do you have any guns, drugs, pornography, or Bibles? Just juxtaposing those words together: guns, drugs, pornography, or Bibles. That covers everything, right? But they're looking for, like a pirated copy of Dr. Zhivago, which was okay under Khrushchev, which was totally illegal under Brezhnev. When we were there, Brezhnev was running the place. This is taken from the dorm room in our dormitory at Leningrad State, looking out of the dorm window to the Dnieper River. And again, this city was created out of swampland by Peter the Great in 1703. And, a lot of it looked like Venice. I mean, he hired armies of Italian and German and French architects and engineers to build, which is basically a European city there, because he was anxious to catch up with the West, and he wanted to get caught up with the Western civilization as fast as he could. Beautiful place. Needed a paint job, that's for sure, but beautiful place. So here, now we are in the dormitory. You can see the sleeping quarters are pretty intimate in the dormitory. And, you know, it was the kind of thing where real quick you start to learn what the game is here. So in the dorm room, you know, there's this radio and the radio is always playing, and then you try to go to sleep and there's no off button. So you unplug the radio and somebody comes up and says, plug your radio back in. Well, they're listening to everything we're saying through the radio. So, okay, we're being surveilled 24/7. I got that. We were in class, it was like intensive language training class, 6 days a week, allegedly having Sundays off, which we'll get into that. And we got kind of an equal dose of Russian language training and tons of propaganda. And then this here is, the Young Komsomols are the Young Communist League. So if you're sort of showing a proclivity to maybe becoming educated and then becoming a member of the Communist Party, or maybe becoming a manager of a factory or somehow being, you know, brought up like that because you've got the right attributes or whatever, those are the Young Komsomols. And so they would stage like a meeting, like get together between us Americans, about 30 American kids, and all these Young Komsomols, right? And these are like hardcore communist, you know, 20-year-olds. And here's the dilemma, right? So what's going on in 71? Well, Vietnam War is raging. Everybody, 1970, were all violently against the Vietnam War by that time. And now we find ourselves in a room with a bunch of hardcore communist kids being trained as party members, and we're not just shooting the breeze about things. They start hammering us with all the atrocities that our government is committing in Vietnam. And why are we there? And I mean, this was not some social occasion. All of a sudden, we're just getting hammered about Vietnam and our government's policy toward Vietnam. And we kind of just listened to that. But we went back to the dorm and it was like, okay, how's this work? Are we here as students as representative of the US government in some way, and therefore obliged to defend the government's policies when confronted like this with people like this in this country? Or do we say what we feel, which is, yeah, you're right, guys, Vietnam War is it's a huge illegal mistake, and we got to get out as soon as we can. I mean, what it was a dilemma. And I think we went back with the same guys later, and we decided, you know, they don't have they can't do what we can do. We have the freedom to speak our mind and say, we think our government's wrong, and we think the policy is totally misguided, and we're against it. That's what we should say. Now, maybe that's not what the consulate in Helsinki would want us to say, but are we going to exercise the one thing they don't have, which is free speech? Or do we kind of toe the government line and just sort of avoid this dilemma? So that was kind of a cool dilemma to struggle with the students. And nobody's giving you any guidance. It's like nobody knew how to answer these questions. But I think we erred on the side of, let's tell it like it is, you know. So right thing to do, wrong thing to do, I don't know. Okay, so this is just in one of the lecture halls. And what does the sign say? Anybody can read it. It says, Lenin Gil, Lenin Jif, Lenin Buddha Jif. That means Lenin lived, Vladimir Lenin is still alive, and Lenin will always live. So anyway, we got tons of great Russian language education, reading, you know, Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky in Russian and all that. But tons of great anti-capitalist propaganda mixed in with it. But here's the deal, right? So we had a mix of students, and every day this professor, the main foreign language professor, would read the roll call in the morning. You know, just go through the roll call list. Господин Dragon, Господин Smith, you know, and you get to this one kid. His name was Michael Gentner. And you get to this kid's name, you say, guess where they didn't get there? And he'd stop and he'd put the thing down. He said, guess where they didn't get there? Это фашистами, да? Это фашистами. And he's reminding the kid his surname is German, but he's not using the word German. He's using the word fascist, which is fascist, which is Nazi. And every morning, at every roll call, he would stop the roll call and stop and basically call this kid, American student, happens to have German surname, a Nazi. Just to, kind of rub it in. Other kids had names like, Goldsberg or Jewish surnames. Same kind of thing, right? I mean, just this racist sort of just poking at you all the time, you're a Nazi, okay, we'll go on with the roll call. You're a Nazi, you're just American college student. But it was just now this is like a 35-year-old young professor. Why would he do that? But again, World War II, and when we were there, only ended like 27 years before that. The way we rendered time that was ages ago. The way Russians render that was like World War II stopped about 6 minutes ago, right? So I get the whole Nazi German surname thing in a way that doesn't explain it really. So we thought that our mission there as exchange students was to interact with Russians. Sounds reasonable, right? Why? Okay, we're there to learn a language, but that's not the whole thing. We should be. Now, that's what we thought our goal was, among other things, was to interact with as many Russian students and citizens, and on our day off, jump on the subway and do all that. Well, our Russian handlers absolutely would not have any. Their mission was the opposite. Their mission was to keep us off the streets, to keep us from interacting almost at all with the Russian students we were going to school with. They did not want Russians to be exposed to Americans. And we thought that's why we were there, at least from our point of view, to interact with Russian people, regular people. Well, if the Russian kids got too chummy, that's what happens to them. I don't know if you can see, but these goons would show up and beat the living crap out of those Russian kids right in front of you and everybody in front of the dorm. As a message to them and us and everybody else, don't get too chummy with the Americans, or we're going to do that to you. I mean, they don't hide this stuff. They just do it, and they don't intend to. They beat those kids up just as publicly as they can to make their point. So, and yet a lot of these kids, they were just hungry to learn something about America. This is the first time any Americans have been in the university, and they just were desperate to hear more about America. And unfortunately, they had this utopian Wizard of Oz notion of America being this Oz place. But anyway, it was great risk that they took to interact with us. And a lot of them disappeared or whatever. And it was very traumatic for us. But some smart person told us, hey, in your luggage, when you go over there, be sure to throw some Frisbees in your luggage. It's like, okay, so we did. And so that's a picture taken from the dorm room of a couple of the Americans down there just start playing Frisbee, throwing Frisbee back and forth. Pretty soon you got 10 or 20 Russians standing around wondering what the hell you're doing. They've never seen a Frisbee. Pretty soon you got 100 Russians standing around and you start showing them how to play Frisbee. And pretty soon everybody's throwing. This is the ultimate icebreaker. And even the goons and our Russian handlers that didn't want us to do things like interact with Russians couldn't stop the Frisbees. They couldn't stop 100 people from playing Frisbee in front of the dorm. I mean, it was just a really cool, great idea whoever told us to do that. And then, we were just as sequestered from the West as the Russians were. We had no exposure to anything, certainly not media or anything. The Russians, of course, never did either. What the Russians did was they erected these huge jamming towers around big cities like Leningrad. And so that would prevent any broadcast from Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, from being heard or picked up by any radios or whatever in Russia. Right? So what the kids would do, they got a grandfather or an uncle that lives outside the city limits, 20 miles away from Leningrad, and they'd go out there on the weekend and hang out with grandfather. And they made their own, I'm sure some of you made some of these crystal radio sets. You remember that from shop class back in the day? Well, these kids would make these little crystal radio sets, which could pick up Voice of America because it's outside of the ring of jamming that's in the big cities. And they were our source, the only source we had of news. What the hell was going on in America or anywhere else? And again, these kids are taking huge risks to do this kind of stuff. And we'd have to meet clandestinely with these kids. They said, look, meet me under that bridge at 9 o'clock tonight and, let's talk. And that's how you learn what was going on, or that's how we got to talk. Kind of not dangerous for us, but gigantically dangerous for them. 1971 was right in the middle of this huge shortage under Brezhnev's government. And so food was very hard to come by. Sure, we could eat in the cafeteria, but you didn't get much to eat at all. And so we'd have to stand in line like everybody else. Like if one had a couple loaves of bread in the dorm that night, you'd have to, people would wait for an hour to buy bread. So would we. I was a pretty skinny kid to begin with. I lost 28 pounds that I didn't have to lose, but we used our money belts to hold up our pants because there just was no food and there were no vegetables, no fruits for sure. Superpower, can't get rid. Now, we were told before we went in that we could make a phone call back home like once a week if we scheduled it ahead of time, a few days. Of course, that was a total lie. That never happened. We were never allowed to make a call. We certainly couldn't receive a call. And every once in a while, we'd get a big batch of letters like this. All of them had been opened and read and, kind of mishandled from your parents. It's just, and of course, whether our letters got back to home or not were problematic. I think a few did, but so we were, kind of in that isolated environment for sure. And the best friend I kind of had was this guy Ginsberg, fortunately a Jew, because he took just endless abuse. Anti-Semitism was crazy. And we both got arrested one day in a little town about 200 miles north of Leningrad. It was an excursion and we were taking pictures, and there were very strict rules about taking photographs that the embassy people gave us. Like, you cannot take a picture from a building from above the first floor. If you take a picture from the second floor, the Russians will think you're taking military aerial photographs for military use. So don't do that. And then the list was this long of don'ts about photographs. So we were very careful, but we still got arrested and spent a night with my Jewish friend in a Soviet, kind of, small town jail thing, which was, but we, because we were American, we got out of there. Now let's talk about religion for a minute. So one of the most insidious things for the American kids to deal with was this notion of religion. So I'm not particularly religious, but a lot of the kids were. And remember, we're living in a era of Soviet, militant atheism. And if any of us use the word atheism or atheist, to me, it's a word that describes the absence of something, the absence of belief in some religious tenet, right? Makes you an atheist. Okay, but that's not what, the Soviets, the militant in front of the word atheism, which is that word right there, which is kind of the word for war is right there. And there's Bez Bozhnikov. Bez means without, Bozh is God, Nikov is a person, so you're an atheist, that's how you say it in Russian. And so you're not just the declaring yourself an atheist, your mission is to crush any religion in the country being practiced by anybody, any religion. I don't care if it's Taoism or whatever. It's not allowed, and they snuff it out. And they've got their own kind of printed propaganda. Here's, the Christ being tossed out of a wheelbarrow from a factory. I mean, it was just. And when you did, and there was one synagogue open in Leningrad, and maybe 3 Eastern Orthodox churches that were still open. All the other ones were either closed in one way or the other. But one of them, which was the cathedral Catherine the Great built, was a temple completely devoted to atheism. And every display and the thing was basically a recounting of all the horrors that religion has inflicted on the world since the beginning. The Crusades, and every religion there's plenty of opportunities to tell ugly stories about religious extremism and the Crusades and how many people, I mean, there's a lot of material there. And they devoted this gigantic, spectacular cathedral to atheism. And so you go through the exhibits and, it's just one horror story another about how religion has done all this terrible stuff. And then you get to the last room, the last exhibit, and you walk in, and here's about an 8-foot cutout of Charles Manson. Remember Charles Manson? 1969. I mean, I'm sure you would remember Charles Manson. And Charles Manson is the person running the tour is explaining how in America today, Charles Manson is this religious cult leader, and he's sort of the most popular religious figure in America. And the Russians and you're standing next to a classroom of Russian young pioneer students, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, and they're listening to this, believing every word of it. Now this guy, is this, and his little gang of whatever they called their little gang of murdering, whatever. And they're describing this horror, the horror stories of Charles Manson, cloaked in the notion of he's the main religious guy in America. And pretty soon the 9-year-old's looking up at you. He knows you're an American. It's like, I mean, that's pretty spooky, right? And you can't say anything. We can't object. We can't say, well, wait a minute, tour guide person. This is bullshit. What are you talking about? You got to sit there and just sort of take it and listen to it and have all those little kids looking at you like, wow. That's, and they constantly would, when you get a tour of a gorgeous cathedral like this, they would use the term, the way we use Greek mythology, they would use the term Christian mythology. There's no difference between a Greek mythology and a Christian mythology. It's all superstition. Oh, no. So, and then we went to a young pioneers camp, which are 10 to 15-year-olds who all go to young pioneers training. And, it's kind of a paramilitary kind of deal for kids. And they're all getting, as you can imagine, the education they're getting. But if you look at the Young Pioneers Leaders Handbook, it says, every pioneer will set up an atheist corner at home with anti-religious pictures, poems, and sayings. Because most of their parents were secretly still devout Eastern Orthodox Christians, right? It was against the law and you had to hide it. But most households clung to their religion despite the Soviet, the whole communist atheist thing. And everybody kind of knew it, but they didn't, But imagine your 9-year-old comes home, he says, hey, Mom, I have to set up this atheist corner. Because the parents would set up a little part of the corner of the house where they would have religious icons, kind of an altar kind of a thing. And now the kids are being told, if that's what your parents have, you have to build one, but to atheism in your house. Okay, can you process that kind of stuff? I can't process that kind of stuff. And this is this guy, Bukharin, he was sort of Lenin and Stalin's chief kind of ideologist when it came to the communist version of socialism. In a bourgeois society, a child is viewed as being the property of his parents. That's how the West thinks about it. When parents say use the term their daughter, their son, it implies not only parenthood, but the right of the parent to educate the children. From a socialist point of view, that's completely unfounded. Your kids do not belong to you. Your kids belong to the state. That's who owns them, and that's who's going to educate them. So this notion of who's right, my daughter, my son is the inappropriate way to say in that country. Anyway, that's where these atheists are. This is born in like 1927. Again, this is a country that for 900 years has been devoutly religious. And then Khrushchev comes along in 56, and he did a lot of good things. I mean, he denounced Stalin. He loosened up freedom of speech stuff. You could read books that were used to be banned. But he went way over on criminalizing religion. And these are the three main things he did. He said, it's okay for a believer to attend a church service, but it's against the law for that believer to bring their children into the church. Can't do that, against the law. You can go, but your kids can never go. And if you insisted on having a baptism or a wedding or a funeral in a church, you had to first, and your entire entourage who would attend the wedding would have to file all that with the KGB. That's a disincentive. All of a sudden, you've got a KGB file on you and all your friends and everybody if you insisted on being, baptized in church. And any clergyman who criticized atheism in any way, straight to jail. So that was, this is the religious environment they're living in. Then Putin comes along, 2014, embraces Orthodox Christianity. Remember, he's a card-carrying member of the Union of Militant Atheists his entire life, but now he is building his whole kind of political persona around family values. Sound familiar? And religious, right? So he put all these rules in about homosexuals, and he basically saying, the West is abandoning their Christian values, and therefore we're going to have all these strictures against homosexuals. He put in the Russian Constitution the fact that Orthodox Christianity was the foundation of the country's national identity. That Constitution supported atheism its entire existence. And then there was a law a criminal law against offending the feelings of religious believers, whatever that means. And a tourist or a foreign national who was suspected of being gay could be held for 14 days. Not just for, Russian citizens, but foreign nationals and tourists, if suspected of even being pro-gay, if not gay, could end up in jail in Russia while we were there. And this is not religious, but because I'm working with the SVS here, he decriminalized, this is Putin, domestic violence. And only injuries like concussions or broken bones could potentially lead to criminal charges. That's otherwise beat your wife. Just don't break any bones. So this is 2014. This isn't 1968. This is, yesterday. Before the czars in the 15th century, religion and state were separate. The czars destroyed the state absorbed the church back in those days, the first czars. This guy This guy, he's the patriarch of Moscow, of the Eastern, of the Russian Orthodox Church. His name is Kirill. And again, Putin is now the titular head of the Russian Orthodox Church. And this guy is the patriarch of Moscow. Well, when the Soviet Union fell and people started combing through records in, say, the old KGB office in Hungary or Poland or wherever, and now it's all available. People could get to those records. Turns out Kirill was a KGB agent in Czechoslovakia for his entire life. Putin was a KGB agent, lieutenant general or lieutenant colonel KGB in East Germany. This guy, who's now running the church, was a KGB agent in Czechoslovakia. And it turned out that about, I don't know what percentage of church officialdom were ex-KGB, right? Installed by Putin, ex-KGB. And the latest thing this guy said a few weeks ago was this: head of the church, if we see Ukraine as a threat, we have the right to use force to ensure the threat is eradicated. That's the head of the Moscow, the Russian, church, given the green light to Russians who are religious to, we need to eradicate the Ukrainians. That's the church is saying, okay. And of course, he's the mouthpiece for Putin's other kind of traditional family values pitch, which is people here, well, you can read it. People favor traditional family values over feminism, gay rights, and nation-based states rather than multicultural. Okay? And that whole multiculturalism is evil and it's Western. This is all coming from him in sermons, not him, well, him too, but being constantly reinforced by the church. And this one is the most stunning of all of them. Neither Western freedoms nor laws can bring good by themselves without a fundamental value provided by the state. And I don't care if that state is called Soviet Union or Russia. Only values emanate from the state, even over and above what the Westerners call freedom and laws. Now that's laying it out pretty clear. That the state will define what law means. The state will define what freedom means. And the church is, well, anyway. So I just try to communicate how does this affect a society's notion of belief? Right? Okay, the last thing almost here is how are we doing? Okay. Leningrad, as you surely know, in World War II was subject to one of the worst military sieges in history, any history. For 872 days, the Nazi army encircled Leningrad, could have easily taken the city, but Hitler directed the German troops to stop 10 miles away from Leningrad and to St. Petersburg. At that time was really not Moscow, it was really the heart and soul of Russia for centuries, not Moscow. And so Hitler's main target for eliminating that cultural center of gravity for Russia was to eradicate St. Petersburg. And that meant, oops, wrong button. That means a siege, and that means starving them out. Now, you're going to see this again when we talk about Lenin. I'm sorry, about Putin. And Putin and his family lived in Leningrad, and his mother, his father, and his two older brothers were living there during the siege of Leningrad. And Putin's mother, 14, 1.5 million people died of starvation in Leningrad during the siege of 900 days. And Putin's mother was starving like everybody else, and she collapsed on the sidewalk one day. And these carts would come along and pick up the dead bodies and haul them away. And she was presumed dead, thrown in the back of the cart with the rest of the dead people. But she wasn't dead. She kind of, moved and she wasn't dead. And they revived her and they saved her. But Putin's youngest, or one of his older brothers, died of starvation. And the other brother of Putin was taken away from the mother, and because he was put in a place where it was deemed that if he stayed with his mother, he would starve. So they took children like that and tried to put them in kind of orphanages and feed them enough to keep them alive. So, but he eventually died. So if you want to know some of the origin story of Vladimir Putin, we'll get into it a lot more later. He was born in 1952, but his family history is this. And he talks a lot about it. You can imagine how it affected him. Now he has no problem with laying siege to Ukrainian cities and starving them out, so it didn't have any other good effect on him. He's now practicing it the way the Nazis did. So we visited Vyshgorodskoye cemetery, and it's incomprehensible, I think, certainly for us when we visited it. There are 186 mass graves with 420,000 civilians buried there and 60,000 unnamed military. And the only markers are just, the year. But I mean, this goes on for, if you look at it on Google Maps, it's just gigantic, this 186 mass graves of all the people that died during that siege. So again, 1971, when we're there, this happened a few minutes ago, and it's, and when you visit it, you're blown away, of course. You can't get your head around it. But, and then there's a couple of things about, we visited Estonia, one of the Balkan states that right now is terrified of ending up like Ukraine and being invaded. I know we're putting a whole bunch more troops in the Balkans, like Estonia and Latvia. But it was really clear when you visited, these are not Russians, they're Nordic, they are incredibly independent, remind you a lot of Ukrainians. There's only 25% ethnic Russians in that country, and they pretty much do what they want. I mean, this was still hardcore communism, all Cold War, but you could tell and the thing about the Soviet Union was, if you think about any modern state, its sovereignty is uniform across its borders, right? So let's say Washington, D.C. was in Kansas, and no matter how far away you go from Kansas, the sovereignty of the United States is equal and uniform, and the laws are applied the same, everything's the same. That's a modern state. Geography doesn't matter when it comes to sovereignty. But in Russia during these times, and even now, in a lot of ways, and the Ukrainian war is kind of a symptom of this, the Soviets, as powerful as they seem to be, the Soviets, every mile you moved away from Moscow in any direction, the strength of their control diminished. So when you got to the Balkan states, it wasn't uniform. They could not control them like they could control Russian, nearby places. You go to Siberia, it's uncontrolled, it's ungovernable. Right? You go down to Ukraine, Armenia, the power of the state dissolves and diminishes with every mile you leave the center. That is not a modern state. That is a medieval state. And so, their power it's interesting. So they've failed several times to exert their centralized power over places like the Ukraine. And they haven't done it, and they're not going to do it this time. I don't think either. But it's amazing how kind of medieval their system is in that regard. So when we were in Leningrad, I told you we lost 30 pounds. Most of us were skeletons because you go into a grocery store in Leningrad, and that's what you find. We fly to Kiev, Ukraine, and you find this. 1971, same country. You get off the airplane, you go to the hotel, you have lunch, and this cornucopia of fruits, vegetables, and meats shows up at the table. And we hadn't seen any of those things for 4 months, and it showed. And so, you know, we're like, holy crap, where'd this come from? We asked the waiter, you know, kind of, where's all this food coming from? And he just said, we're Ukrainians, this is our country. This is 1971, it could have been 1950, 41, it could have been 1862, it could have been today. And they grow, this is the breadbasket of Europe and a whole bunch of the countries beyond Europe. And to think that the all-powerful Soviet Union cannot transport food from here to here because their freight trains, I think, average 9 miles an hour. They don't have refrigerated trucks. This isn't 1926. This is 1971. How do they not have refrigerated trucks? I'm sorry. I mean, they have nuclear missiles and the biggest armies and all that, but they can't get food from, besides, these guys told us, we'll burn it in the field before we send it up to those assholes. And they can, and they did. And, yeah.
Speaking of the railroads that weren't refrigerated, did they have uniform tracks through the country of Russia, or did the gauges change?
I don't think. I think when you went into a different republic, so if you moved from the Russian Republic to the Armenian Republic or the Kazakhstan or Belarus, you would find different infrastructure. So I think that's not everywhere, but I think that was. But again, these are like insurmountable problems for the Soviet government.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget looking into the eyes of that waiter who said, you know, we're Ukrainians. What do you think? I mean, that's a long time ago, and so good luck beating them. And that's kind of it. Just some pictures from the trip. I mean, the most popular thing you could buy was ice cream. They make awesome ice cream, and people would wait in line for hours to get. Well, not hours, but you really. It's called morozhne. It's awesome. But one thing that was not so awesome was they had these big like Coca-Cola stands, soft drink stands, in big public space, a whole bunch of them lined up. And the idea is you could throw 5 kopecks in there and get a drink of some Coca-Cola kind of thing. The problem was one of the great shortages in Russia throughout all that time was paper. The Russians couldn't make paper very well. This is a copy of Pravda from August 17th, 1971, we were there. And by the way, I kept this because the lead article with these smiling people, those are Ukrainian farmers, collective farms being lauded for their meeting their quota or exceeding their quota of grain harvests. And look how happy they are. Yeah. But books, anything made out of paper. So you go up to this big, stand where you could get a fresh drink of something. And of course, they didn't have paper enough for paper cups. So there's a glass sitting on the thing. And everybody uses the same glass because there is no paper to make paper cups out of, and there's certainly no plastic yet. So you go up there and you're kind of waiting in line thinking, am I going to do this? But see, they had it all, it was cool because next to the glass that everybody used, there was like this little thing, you put it down, it would squirt water on the glass. Kind of remove the last guy's identity. But if you're thirsty enough, you'll do anything, I think. So anyway, that was just one of those freaky little moments. And then more, again, here are the trains. I mean, infrastructure. I think this is kind of interesting. So one thing that, the one thing that, whoops, sorry, Khrushchev did, in addition to food shortage and everything else, the other gigantic shortage was housing during those days, in the 60s and 70s. And Khrushchev initiated this breakneck effort to build what were always still called Khrushchevskis, which are these prefab, bolt together concrete erector set buildings, right? And you could put up huge apartment blocks, in weeks, and then just keep putting them together. And it created a whole bunch of new housing. The problem is the basic apartment for a couple with maybe one child, well, God damn it, this was 323 square feet. If you're a little bit higher up, maybe you've got a government job and you're a little bit higher up in the food chain, you could get an apartment with 474 square feet. And maybe you got grandma and grandpa with you that need more room. And if you're really somebody, you get 646 square feet. That's the big luxury apartment, which is, what do you think how many square feet in this room? I don't know. I don't know, more than that. I don't know. But again, this is a gigantic leap forward to be able to have housing at all, let alone, so. And if you look at a lot of these scenes of the ruins now in the Ukraine, there's a whole bunch of these apartment blocks that they're just, pulling apart. And then last is this whole thing. Now, when we get to the Ukrainian Day, which is dedicated to nothing but Ukrainian history from, again, the Bolshevik Revolution to now, we're going to hear about what's called the Holodomor. And in Ukrainian, holod means starve, to starve. And Holodomor is murder by starvation. And so what Lenin, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but what Lenin did in 1932, 1933 was, and this is where the Ukraine is, and this is where the center of this huge, totally artificially induced famine occurred, where about 5-7 million Ukrainians died of starvation in the breadbasket of the world, because Stalin implemented collectivization, collectivized farms, and his word for it was requisitioned the crops from the Ukrainians and shipped it north, starving the Ukrainians, starving the very people that are growing the grain for the country. He killed 7 million. And again, this is something we'll get into later, but it's just, when you're in the Ukraine, you'll find out that there's this special kind of soil, this black soil, and it only occurs in 2 places in the world, on the earth. There's a little bit of it in Manitoba and in Canada and down into the Dakotas a little bit. It's a black earth that has this natural load of humus and potassium and all this great stuff that normally you have to use fertilizers for. It's all in there already. And the earth is like pitch black, like coal. It's so rich. And the crop yields are just crazy. And, they are great. And yet, and right now, Putin is creating this gigantic food shortage around the world because, hundreds of millions of tons of grains are sent to Europe, the Middle East, China, and the Ukrainians. That's their land. And ports are closed, war is going on. People all over the world are not going to get fed because of this war in Ukraine, because hundreds of millions of tons of grain come from this one special place on the planet Earth that has this special soil, you know, right there where Ukraine is on the Black Sea. And it's also where 7 million people were starved to death who grew this stuff during the Stalin years. So, but we'll get into that. And again, I just found it beyond ironic that, you know, they're showing smiling Ukrainians at that time. Okay, I'm done. How am I doing? Could have been worse. I try to stay to an hour, but it never works out like that. Any questions? Like I say, next week is when we actually dive into the kind of chronological history of ancient Russia, the Kievan Rus, back when it was created out of a bunch of warring Slavic pagans tribes, and this new thing called what we call now Russia was generated out of it. We'll go all through that, and we'll go right through the Russian Empire, through Catherine the Great, and how the Russians got all the way to the Pacific. Anyway, that's all next week. By the way, there's a lot of snow in the forecast for next week. If you've had, I don't know if you looked ahead next week, but there's a lot of snow, and it could be that Wednesday is going to be a very wintry day. So I have all your email addresses, and if it looks a little too hairy, I wouldn't want to drag you guys into this if it's snowing like crazy. So just keep your eye out, and we'll see how it goes. It's too early to. I'm not canceling it. I'm just saying it looks a little dicey next Wednesday. So, any questions?
On the genocide in the Ukraine, when I read Bloodlands, it was, as I remember it, and this could be all wrong, that they were killed because they didn't, or they were starved to death because they didn't represent what Russia wanted their people to look like. They looked at these people and thought they were simple and plain and not progressive and so on. Was that accurate or not accurate, or is my interpretation?
Well, I mean, there was a couple of things. I mean, one is the greatest threat to Joseph Stalin during those years was an independent Ukraine. He had absorbed all the other areas he called republics, like Kazakhstan and Armenia and Belarus, you know, all but as usual, the Ukrainians resisted. They resisted Lenin during the Bolshevik Revolution. He had to conquer the Ukrainians twice. And then Stalin, the only reason he did that was the Ukraine was a threat because of their independent-minded resistance to Soviet collectivization, right? And so every independent farmer that was any good at farming, maybe they had a few livestock, maybe they hired a few people working on the farm. They were called kulaks. Remember that term kulak? To the Soviet mind, kulaks were private enterprise, the opposite of communism, the opposite of collectivization. And nobody fought harder, the whole idea of collectivizing, and then the kulaks. And because they were the most successful farmers, because they grew their own food and they sold their own food and they hired people. They did everything a good capitalist farmer would do. And the only way for him to remove that threat from his communist project to totally collectivize the country was to eliminate them. I mean, they wouldn't, and they still won't, they will not bend. And they paid handsomely for it. Over 100,000 kulak families were sent to Siberia and or Kazakhstan to get them. But what created the famine was mainly the fact that they were called red trains, these huge trains of carts and wagons that would go to every farm and load it up with all the grain that were in the warehouses and take it north. The same year of the Holodomor, that famine you're talking about, 1933, while this famine is going on, he exported 300 million tons to other countries to get money, right? That was his source of cash. They couldn't sell oil or gas yet, but they could sell grain. So what you do is you go down to Ukraine, take the grain from the farmers, leave them starving, and sell it to whoever, anybody on the market. Right? So this is not, I don't think this is an ethnic thing. It was the same story we're going to hear over and over again for the ages until this very moment, which is the Ukrainians will not bend to autocracy. Every one of them will go down fighting and dying before they will submit to them. Because the other republics in the Soviet Union kind of rolled over and, not the Ukrainians. They are different. They've always been different.
Hey, Randy, I was interested when you talked about the sphere of influence and powers that got farther away from the.
Yeah.
In 2015, I spent a month in Russia. Half of it was St. Petersburg and half in Moscow. I saw a big difference between the two in
Yeah.
terms of friendliness, culture. Is that influence that you're talking
Yeah.
about within the country?
Yeah, sure.
Because St. Petersburg was very, very different than Moscow.
Yeah, no, they are. And I mean, Moscow is just, it's the Death Star in Star Wars. I mean, it's the
I was
center.
in the University of St. Petersburg and University of Moscow, and the contrast was just very different.
Yeah, and it's always been run different. I mean, for a long time, Vladimir Putin was not the mayor of St. Petersburg, but he was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg. And again, St. Petersburg was always the cultural center of gravity for the country for hundreds of years. And they loved being separated from Moscow, Kremlin, the dark place. So, but yeah, they
St. Petersburg University was more open and interested
Yeah.
in Russian culture. Moscow was very closed and very tight, more like what you described when
right,
you were there. And
yeah.
so I just wondered that within his own country, the farther you get away from Moscow, it diminishes, I assume.
It does, and even though that doesn't seem far away from Moscow, again, there's this illusion that they've got this iron fist control over the whole thing. Not so much. Anything else? to say?
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
why did you go to Russia in the first place? I mean, were you just interested in?
No, really. So when I was a kid watching Walter Cronkite on the evening news, and May 1st, May Day, they would always show Red Square in the Soviet Union with all the missiles and all the military parades. And there were all these signs up, these gigantic posters in this weirdo language, right? I was really into language. I mean, I couldn't add 2 and 2. I couldn't get out of Algebra 1, but I was really good at Latin, and I lived in LA, so I spoke Spanish. You have to. It's the second largest Spanish speaking city in the whole world besides Mexico City, so it's good to learn Spanish in LA.
Yeah.
But so I was really, language was my thing. And I saw, and I looked at that language on the evening news. It's like, okay, what is that stuff? It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen in Europe. It's not Oriental, it's not Chinese or Japanese. What are the weird language? What are the crazy alphabet? And so I was really intrigued by it, just because it was a really interesting language. And all I cared about was language.
Oh.
And next week, I'm going to teach you some Russian. So hold on, because I'm really into this linguistic stuff. And whether or not you are or not, I'm going to drag you through something. Okay. So we're gonna dissect the Cyrillic alphabet, and I want you to be able to speak a little, be able to read a little Cyrillic. So, and I'm sorry if you don't want to do that. That's what we're going to do. Okay. That's just the way I'm running it. So goddamn it, you're going to learn some Russian. Yeah.